I want to move on to the presidential race and what we're seeing so far. One of the things that's really struck me as I've been reading about what folks are thinking heading into 2024 is this notion that a majority of the country does not want to see a Biden versus Trump rematch. What do you guys think about that? Where do you stand on the notion that those could be the two people that represent the two major political parties heading into 2024? Anybody can jump in.
I don't want to see it.
Disappointing.
I don't want to see it.
It's sad. It's
So
disappointing.
nobody here wants that to be the rematch?
Correct.
Wouldn't be my preference, that's for sure.
If that were the case, would that influence anybody's factor here into thinking about a third party?
No.
Probably not.
No?
No.
There's too much at stake.
If there's
No.
Right.
a third party for Congress, I would support. If there was another caucus in Congress that was made up of Republicans and Democrats, which is supposedly what the Problem Solvers Coalition is. But they don't act like a coalition. They just go back to their parties after they talk. But if there were 30 to 40 votes that were not Republican and were not Democratic, a third party, a real third party,
Yeah.
that would disrupt and change Congress. Having a third party president doesn't change anything.
Okay, so we have a variety of political opinions here sitting with us, but I do want to ask some of the specifics of some of the key things that have come up when it comes to these candidates, Biden and Trump, that we just talked about. Should they become their parties' respective nominees? When it comes to the presidential race, how important is age? Besides the fact you have to be at least 35 constitutionally speaking.
If the two of them are running, they're 3 years apart. So age on both sides is the same. There's no question that people age at a different rate. Some people at 90 are very functional, some people at 40 are not.
What do you think?
To me, it's not an issue of age, it's an issue of effectiveness, and it's an issue of what their ideas are, and also if they actually have the capacity to achieve them. So someone could be, as was said, someone could be 85 and still be very with it and able to do the job of president very well. But someone who's 85 also could not, and it can be more challenging at that advanced age. So I don't think it's the age itself, I think it's how the person is at their age.
I agree.
Everyone thought I was talking about older age. What about younger age? 38, say. Is that okay? Does that factor in once you've met the 35 age threshold?
I think it depends on their experience.
Okay. Another one I want to ask about, obviously, former President Trump is facing a multitude of criminal actions and civil actions. How does that factor into this conversation?
Even if there weren't any, I wouldn't lean towards him. So even if there weren't any indictments and there was nothing going on, he's not somebody that I would vote for.
I don't understand how we can give somebody a job that's undergoing, a criminal investigation like that. How does he travel to other countries? I don't understand how that works.
Plane.
Right, but will they allow him in other countries, when he's got ongoing legal issues?
I think his legal issues are a reflection of how he's acted over the last 4 years in public. I can't see how people support him. I'm just sorry.
I just can't.
Jack, what are you thinking?
To me, it's just an outgrowth of his actions. It's not a major issue influencing my vote.